We'd like to introduce Professor Geoff Ward as Principal of Homerton College for the benefit of YouTube visitors. Steve Watts and myself, Peter Cunningham, are retired senior members of Homerton, which is a group comprising lecturers and tutors, administrators and household staff. Geoff, you've been our principal for since 2013, and as you come to the end of your term of office, we wanted to preserve for the college archive your experience and reflections on your time here. Homerton's distinctive history over 250 years has been providing higher education with a particular commitment to public service in preparing teachers for state schools, primary and secondary. Since 2000, that role has expanded to include the whole range of humanities, arts and sciences, and professional training in medicine and engineering, for example. Against your own background as a poet and writer, teaching for 40 plus years in universities from Liverpool to Dundee, London, and now Cambridge, we're hoping to explore briefly some of your observations on change and development in higher education over that time. And in that way, the recent history of Homerton, I think, might be seen in a wider national as well as local context. So, Steve, would you like to start the ball rolling?
Sure. Geoff, I mean, you come into Homerton's life at an interesting time in its life, but also an interesting time in yours, because I'm thinking of a career spent in universities, but also as a writer of critical works, but also as a poet and more recently a novelist. Can you say a little bit more about how your own career either developed or changed because of your coming in to be Homerton's principal?
Sure, and thank you for this occasion, this opportunity to talk about myself, which of course I can do endlessly, but also more importantly to say things about Homerton that may be of interest to retired senior members or people who are not even members yet of Homerton, but may become so. Poetry was very important to me. I always kind of liked it, but I had a kind of epiphany when I was 14, it was 1968, and a very enterprising teacher of French in my school walked in and said, right, I'm going to give you 2 poems by somebody called Baudelaire. They're in French, you're going to translate them. I'm coming back in 3/4 of an hour. And he gave us La Cloche Fallée and Harmonie du Soir. We had to pick one, so I picked Harmonie du Soir. And I made a complete hash of translating this, but I realized as I was reading it and thinking about the images and the use of sound and the whole environment of that poem, I thought, oh, poetry is fascinating. I want to do this. I didn't know what doing it meant at that point. I didn't know if it meant just reading it, writing about it, or what. I just knew that I wanted more of this experience. And then that was consolidated when it must have been shortly afterwards. There was a bookshop in Manchester called Wilshaw's in John Dalton Street. So now, as then, the Arts Quarter, but it's kind of grown. And if you went into this bookshop and you went right to the back, there was a table specially set aside with foreign imports. I've got one here, which is a City Lights book, Pocket Poets. Happens to be the poetry of Malcolm Lowry, which I'm not very interested in, but it's a City Lights book that I had nearby. And this really appealed to me, these books which you could literally put in your pocket, that had something of the samizdat or the underground or the 45 RPM single about them. As an object, it's quite kind of cool. It's not like, you know, a complete Milton in a library. There's something sort of special about this. And that got to me too, and those poets, Allen Ginsberg et al. Got to me as well. So that was a kind of important stage for me that I wanted to, as I say, do this, though I didn't quite know what the doing would involve. But eventually, of course, it turned into an English degree, and it turned into writing books on poets, and it turned into writing my own poetry, and so on, all of which has been very, very central to me. But I'm lucky that I ended up in a university, and that universities are very atypical working environment. You can go in doing one thing, and then 10 years later, you're still in the university, but you can be doing something completely different. And that also has been very important to me, has been a kind of surfing amateurism that just led me from one thing to another, having a go at this, having the opportunity to try that. And that's been my good fortune.
Was there anything about choosing, the last of the things we're looking at with you here in Homerton, that made it more difficult, more easy, or affected in some ways you're trying to be a creative as well as a critical writer?
If I've understood what you're asking correctly, I did have a long moment when I accepted the role at Homerton, and I thought to myself, one of two things is going to happen. Either everything I've done is going to be potentially useful in this role, Dundee, Liverpool, half a lifetime as a lecturer and so on, or none of it is going to be useful. I'm back in Cambridge after a lapse of decades, and Cambridge is Cambridge is Cambridge, and all of that stuff is not going to help me in this unique environment and this very special place, Homerton. Actually, I found that it was all useful, one way and another. It was all transferable. So I'd had those experiences in those places, but although I was no longer in those places, there were analogues in Homerton or the world of the University of Cambridge, which made all of it useful at some point or other.
Okay, thanks. I think Peter wants to ask you more about that very kind of topic about your previous experience. So I'll hand over to him.
Thank you.
Okay. So it was really in the context of the institutions, Geoff, and the changes which you've experienced both over time and the regional variations in higher education. So I was wondering how your experience while lecturing in Liverpool and then as deputy principal in Dundee and vice principal at Royal Holloway, how that experience built up and fed in ultimately. Later we can discuss what you brought to Homerton. So things like the trends in teaching methods and technologies, for example, over that period.
Sure. So my first paid full-time university lectureship was in Liverpool, a move that wasn't in any way intended or deliberate on my part. It was all Margaret Thatcher's fault. It was the end of the 1970s, and I was taken aside by a friend and supervisor in Clare, the late Richard Gooder, who always looked after me, bless him. And he said, "You think you want to go on, don't you, and sort of do this for a living? It's a bit premature, but we think if you want a university job, you better start putting in, because we think that the door's going to close." And the door did indeed close. And Liverpool, I applied and I got lucky, I got the job, but I had a sense that I would have gone anywhere in the British Isles that had offered me a job at that point. So that was that. Of course, they were, you talk about technology, I mean, there really wasn't any. We spent a short half day on teaching the teachers. I was put in front, I was videoed giving a kind of lecturette. Their only advice to me at the end of it was that I shouldn't stand with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, which is what I was doing. And that was it. That was the sum total of professionalizing my teaching practice. So you were just thrown in the deep end and you did it. I was hired as a specialist in American literature, and the first thing I ever taught was George Eliot's Middlemarch, which I hadn't read. I can remember saying to my my class, my first class, we're going to meet, you know, next Monday, and I want you all to have read Middlemarch, thinking to myself, you better read it too, mate. But that was the way it was then. You had to be a kind of all-rounder in English. You had to be able to do it all, basically, you know, from Shakespeare to now, and that was that. And that was good in a lot of ways. It was good. Yeah.
Was Liverpool a great place to be teaching or to be a poet in that period? I mean, one thinks of it as...
Yeah, it was hair-raising at times. I lived in Liverpool 8, Toxteth, the first years, and so lived through the riots. The houses all got burned down up to the end of my road, Grove Park, which I took to be nature's way of saying that it was time to move. So I moved to St Michael's Hamlet, which was 5 minutes walk away. So Liverpool 8 was quite something, yeah. In those days, quite abrasive, in your face place, but yes, with a lot going on in terms of writers, and quite generous spirited writers like the late Adrian Henry, who weren't just there writing, but were very willing to be available, to be there, to be the center of a kind of quite wide circle that let people in, and that I think offered alternative avenues to young people who might have been stuck in terms of potential employment, you know, that you could seriously think about going into music, the arts, and so on. So people like Adrian were very important.
Yeah.
To the community there. There was an arts community in the sense that there hasn't always been in all the places that I've been.
And so you moved on up to Dundee, Geoff, and I'm interested in the changes and the contrasts in student populations, you know, between the cultures of these two different cities and two universities. Was that striking? Or? Yeah,
Scotland is a village, really, and it poses, therefore, difficulties for institutions which find themselves locked in place in a certain kind of cultural scene from which it can be perhaps hard to escape. So I wanted very much, when I was made deputy principal of Dundee, to kind of work with this place to get it somewhere more prominent and put more emphasis on the vibrant things and the good things that I knew were there, but that weren't always seen as being there, because you were locked in this village hierarchy where Edinburgh was it. Edinburgh was the capital and was splendid. Glasgow was the sometimes slumbering, but a slumbering giant. And then the rest, you know, St Andrews was really an international university that happened to be on Scottish soil. Yeah. And the rest, Dundee, Strathclyde, Stirling, and so on, perfectly good places, but they couldn't break out of this sort of Premier League kind of hierarchy. It was very, very difficult. So in that sense, it was quite different from the English higher education scene, where Liverpool, say, was large enough to remake itself to be a different Liverpool. Likewise, Manchester and so on, and probably the most protean of all in my working lifetime was Warwick, which, you know, became, I think, very successful, actually partly through a certain absence of defining characteristics, and a very, very visionary registrar, Shattuck, who helped turn this into, you know, somewhere very, very much that people wanted to go to. But there was a certain fluidity, there's a kind of built-in fluidity of possibilities, I think, in the English higher education scene, which I didn't find so much in Scotland. Flipping that round, though, the Scottish universities, I think, all did a very good job of serving their regional and local communities. Yeah. And were kind of locked in place. And a lot of local pride in a place like Dundee University, you know, the town, very proud of both its universities, but Dundee University in particular. And that was very heartening, and I was lucky I was able to work with that. I did a lot of liaison work with the council, over art in the city, the idea of a cultural quarter and so on. And that was very, you know, I'm very pleased with what we were able to achieve there, which eventually, after my time, it all laid the ground for the new V&A.
Yes, gone from strength to strength.
Gone from strength to strength, but it started with things like the DCA, the Dundee Centre for Contemporary Art, of which I was a non-executive director and really loved. Its first director was Andrew Nairn, who's now director of Kettle Yard in Cambridge.
So racing on, Geoff, just because we want to pursue you through the career. You come south to Royal Holloway, which you know, is in the sort of rural suburbs beyond London, and I think probably recently combined with Bedford College to create an independent university, having been a College of London University. But I just, if I'm right about that, I'm not sure. But you know, wondering about the students again, their sort of ambitions, their approaches to learning, and so on. Is there a great deal of change in that culture?
It was certainly changed from Dundee and from Liverpool, that's for sure. What happened, I think, was that when I was at Dundee, I realized that although my background was in English and such kind of fluency as I had was in the arts, I was becoming rather fascinated by the sciences and medicine in particular. So the first thing that the then principal of Dundee, Sir Alan Langland, said to me was, your background's in English, isn't it? And I said, yes. And he said, well, go down to Nine Wells Hospital and see what they're doing about electing a dean and tell me what's going on there. And while you're there, find out about everything else that's going on there in that hospital. So I did, and was very soon doing things that I wasn't at all competent to do, but I was doing them anyway, like chairing fitness to practice panels for medics and so on. And I found all that fascinating. However, I did so much of that by the time I finished my stint, I was thinking I would in some way like to go back into the arts, be involved with a university, an institution that was very focused on the arts. This job came up of Dean of the Arts Faculty at Royal Holloway, and I thought that's me. The idea of being in close contact with a music department, you know, which Dundee had not had, an English department, yes, but all, you know, classics, the works, and that really was quite invigorating. And I was able to be partly responsible for the inauguration of what is now Department of Philosophy. But at the time was just a little reading group with someone from English, someone from politics, someone from et cetera, classics and so on. So that was a lot of fun and took me back into, as I say, the arts and humanities.
Yeah. So I'm probably going to have to push us on a bit, Geoff, and back to Steve. But from what you've been saying, you know, makes a very interesting, lays out a very interesting agenda for your move to Cambridge. But perhaps I'll, you know, having just said one or two things perhaps about that transition, Steve might be asking you a bit more about being back in a collegiate university.
Yes, indeed. And actually, one thing follows on straight away, actually, and just more from what Peter was saying than what I'm about to say, which is that you seem to have been drawn in interesting ways and divergent ways as you move from one institution to another into wanting to make a kind of impact at a structural level, really wanting to begin to change things, and yet also wanting to maintain your interest in your own academic career, your interests, subjects, English, the arts in general. How do they work together? I mean, was this something about trying to keep those two different aspirations together that has been a kind of perpetual motion within your career?
Yeah, it started when I was at Liverpool, and I was talking to the dean of the arts faculty there one day, and the professor of a subject burst into the room in high dudgeon, and a blazing row erupted. And I thought, I'm having an insight here as to behind the scenes at the university. And it began to dawn on me that I was really rather fascinated by this. How did it all work? Why was there such uproar in the department of whatever, about whatever the issue was? And that began to kind of draw me. And then the roles that I've had that I've got most out of and that I've enjoyed, I think have been the roles that have been the most defined. So I knew where I was as a university lecturer. I knew where I was as a head of department, as a dean, and latterly as a principal. All those roles are very clear. People know what you're there for, and they come to you for things, and you know where you are, and they know where you are. I was also, and this felt rather different, 3 times in 2 different universities, a pro-vice chancellor, a deputy principal, a vice principal, they're all the same thing, a PVC. And that was much less satisfying as a role because it relied on a certain baseless mystique. I thought that you weren't anybody's line manager, you were kind of advisory. It didn't suit me so much. So the kind of impact you're talking about and the wish to effect structural change is much more satisfying in certain roles I've had than others. And the most satisfying of all has been principal, not just because it's the top leadership role, the head of the institution, but it's also a very defined role. You know where you are with that role.
Well, you say you know where you are with that role, but of course it's also famously in Cambridge terms a role that is different for everybody who operates within it. I mean, so we know that you can be this kind of principal or that kind of principal. Did you come with preconceived ideas about what kind of principal you want to be?
I wanted to be very visible and approachable. I thought that I'd met some people along the way for whom an element of distance in the role conferred authority in their eyes, and I didn't really want that. I wanted to be known to be approachable, whether it was the gardeners, the students, the bursar, or whoever, the fellows. I just wanted to be the same for everyone. And I would say to, as you'll have heard me say, to incoming freshers every year at that first nervous meeting where they're lined up in the auditorium, and I would always say, call me Geoff. My wife calls me Geoff, the Vice Chancellor calls me Geoff, and you should call me Geoff. And it only backfired the last time I did it, when an hour later I went walking around the grounds and a first year student saw me and said, "Hi, George." And the lesson to be learned from that is that we do rather overload our students when they first arrive, and they can be forgiven these minor errors. But yeah, but I quite enjoyed being George. So yes, it was something where I didn't want distance, and I wanted, because the college itself was going places, and needed to feel more self-confident about all of that. I wanted to get a shared sense that everybody was in this together, because all of it matters. It's very important that the food is good. It's very important that the gardens are lovely and well kept. It's not just matters academic. It's about a whole holistic environment, and if those things are all good, then people will think, well, maybe my daughter should come here as a student. You are what you look like. You are what you seem, and people will take what they see as what you are. And so that was very important to me, as being the kind of principal that could be kind of all round all of it, hopefully.
I mean, one of the difficulties, presumably, when you first came into Homerton was the sense that Homerton itself remained unfixed, that there was, you joined most Cambridge colleges as principal, and what their last 200 or 300 years of history was directing you towards. Homerton had a very odd history, very unusual history in Cambridge terms. Had only just become a college. What difference did that make for you? Did you see that as a kind of blank canvas that you could sort of really show what you wanted the college to look like, or did you see it being more of an orchestrating job?
Yes, it had to be orchestrating. I couldn't have imposed my Homerton on everybody else, and I wouldn't have even tried. It was very important to have what we called a vision and purpose group, to think about who we were and where we wanted to be and how we could get there. And I didn't know quite what was going to emerge from that. What did emerge, I think, was that there were aspects of the college which people perceived wrongly to be disadvantageous, and that they could all really be turned around to advantage. And that began to dawn on me as we did those exercises and as I got used to the role and the people. So people would say, oh, Homerton, you know, we're not in the centre of town, we're not near the river, we're in South Cambridge. Yes, we're in South Cambridge, the only college in South Cambridge. 12 minutes walk from the biggest biomedical campus in Europe, and we don't offer medicine. This is counterintuitive. So there was a whole series of doors that could then be unlocked, which turned that disadvantage of being distant from the centre to positive advantage. That's the geographical aspect, but there were lots of others too. So I felt that what was emerging was opportunities for confidence and assertion of difference. Obviously, all the colleges are the same in one sense. If the student is taking the English tripos or the mathematics tripos, it would better be broadly the same experience in Clare and Homerton and Girton, otherwise something's gone a bit wrong. So there has to be a certain sameness, a consistency across collegiate Cambridge. But as we know, there's still a lot of room for sometimes quite overt and sometimes quite subtle differences of culture and style. And another thing that became very apparent to me was, I think all of us too, was that we should assert ourselves and our difference, and we should not be attempting to play catch up, let alone pastiche what other colleges were doing, because one thing was for sure, that whatever Homerton did, it would never have been founded by Henry VIII. That was just a fact. So there was no point in thinking of ourselves as the latest in a line of institutions we had to emulate. You know, we had our own reality and our own difference, and a lot of that was to do with modernity, the progressive, the newest, you know, living up to all the vitality that being the newest and the biggest imply.
I mean, one thing that made for you happen is you suddenly come into a place where you are, yes, you're a principal, you've got an obvious job to do within the college, but also part of the wider collegiate university. And as a principal of a college, you know, as it were, also a deputy VC for the university when it comes to things like graduating or what have you, but also membership of what can be sometimes a fractious club of different colleges trying, sometimes oddly, with a similar purpose to get there. How did you find that? How did you find that working with other colleges in that system?
It was fascinating. I did feel some sympathy for the Vice Chancellor in Colleges Committee when we'd all be gathered there, the VC, the Registrari and the heads of 31 colleges, and I thought the Vice-Chancellor was really dealing with, in some ways, 31 divas, but that it was more complicated than that, because we'd all be singing in different operas depending on what week or what month it was. So somebody would be going through a Gilbert and Sullivan phase with their college, just as the companion head of house from down the road would be living through Götterdämmerung. You know? So there was all of that. I was braced for perhaps a pecking order, that we were the newest, that maybe therefore we would be in some sense viewed as the last or perhaps the least or something like that. Didn't happen. And I was very pleased about that. I learned that I didn't need to put my armor on when I went into those meetings, and that actually it was appreciated and understood that there was room for, definitely room for, a college which had more informality, which invested less in long tradition and wasn't encumbered by it, and that this was enriching what Cambridge could be and was important. So it was a good experience. I didn't expect that it would perhaps be as good as it immediately was, really. Yeah. Of course, it came in very useful that I'd had a working lifetime in universities, so I could chair appointing panels. I knew how the place worked, and so on. So in that sense, I felt quite comfortable with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor role, and I've always enjoyed those things. Chiefly, perhaps my role at the Fitzwilliam Museum.
Yes, I was going to ask about that, Geoff, because that's a reprise things you've done in both Dundee and in Royal Holloway in an interesting way.
And in fact, Liverpool. I was the university's first liaison person with the new Tate Gallery when that went up in the Albert Dock in Liverpool. So I was actually the first person, I believe, to give a lecture in the gallery on poets of Mark Rothko's generation. There were some Rothkos from the Seagram Foundation around me as I did that. So the Fitz was great, and that's back to the point I made earlier that I've been very lucky working in universities because of the sheer variety of things you can do in a university if you're so minded and if you have the good fortune to be asked. And that variety, I think, has been very important. And I do believe that I did my job in Homerton better because I wasn't always in Homerton, that I went out to the Fitzwilliam, that I went out into the wider university and came back, I think, bringing ideas and so on with me that were no doubt then translated, not directly applied, but I think all that was of benefit to the college one way or the other. And of course, I think it showed that we were, through my commitment, it showed that we were committed as a community, as a college, that, you know, Homerton was willing to party, to be a player, to do things, you know, to be part of its university.
No, I think I agree completely with that. But it's interesting, isn't it, that that does mark a decision made about what kind of principal one wants to be, one that is perfectly happy in going outside the college, because that might be a longer way around it, but ultimately redounds to the value of the college. And you would make that claim, I believe.
Yeah, I think that all of that was important. I think all the things have been important. I didn't see them as annoying extras that I had to do pro bono. I saw it all as part of, as a continuum of activity, which was all going to benefit Homerton one way or the other at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. Peter, you want to come in there?
Yes, I'd like to follow through, really, Geoff, on that, because so broadly what I'd got in mind was to ask what you thought were the most significant ways that we've changed in your 7 years here, and also what were the least expected developments. But just picking up on what you've been talking about, I've often wondered, as we've been through the last 7 years, how within a relatively small domestic institution, the largest college I know in many respects, but I mean, how the arts and the sciences can sort of gel and maintain a sort of single communal identity when you've got people who are medics, people who are engineers, you know, practitioners in the performing arts and poets, and you know, how does that sort of come together in a relatively small collegiate setting?
I think it is. You've put your finger on it immediately. It is the college dimension. Because at the end of the day, although there are a few universities in these islands that lay claim to having colleges, it's only really actually at the end of the day Oxford and Cambridge that do, and that have that extra dimension, which of course goes back so very long in time, but which is the original interdisciplinarity, is the original, you know, it's the coming together of all those disciplines, and the way that to answer also your other question about the way that the college has changed over the last 7-8 years, is we've added those disciplines like medicine, veterinary medicine, and now architecture, and not all colleges offer all the triposes. And I thought it was very important that for the newest and the largest college, if we still are the largest, I'm never quite sure, there or thereabouts, that we should offer all of those, all the triposes. I think that's an important aspect of the holism of it all. And the deliberate invitation to blur the work environment, the research environment, the teaching environment, and the social and eating environment that college life does bring together. And that's the key difference at the end of the day between my experience at Liverpool or Dundee or Royal Holloway vis-a-vis Cambridge, is that Cambridge does offer that extra dimension. I think we've also been lucky in that we've not, as far as I could tell anyway, had bad fallings out or cliques or opposing parties, striving to undermine each other with all the subtlety and Jacobean backstabbing that can go on in some other colleges that will remain nameless. They only exist in my imagination.
So how do you see the pros and cons in as we move into, well, not just the 21st century now, but the post-pandemic era, hopefully post-pandemic, what are the particular pros and cons of ancient universities? And what are the opportunities and challenges or even threats to these very distinctive universities?
There is a little built-in tension in the dynamic between colleges and university in Oxford and Cambridge, but I thought that it was not something to dwell on, really. And I wanted, well, we wanted Homerton to be liked. We want Homerton to work, want Homerton to be a happy place, and feel very positive about the university of which it's a part. So I didn't want to do any pointing to the moat or lifting of the portcullis kind of stuff. I didn't think that was really what we were about or had to offer. I think that we've always benefited from being openly ready to partner, whether it's with the Department of Public Health, whether it's with Adam Brooks, with whoever it's with, and that's very much who we are, working with others. And I think the Changemakers program that we have shows also that we're committed to, we're not an ivory tower. We're well aware that our students are with us for a while, but that they're part of this is a journey for them, and that they're on their way to other places, and that we need to try and help them to get to the places they want to go to after they've left, as well as equipping them to perform academically well while they're here.
Yeah, yes. I think I'd draw it to conclusion. Possibly Steve may well have things to add, but by asking the question, really, what you would see as your major legacies, and also what disappointments, is there anything that you might have liked to achieve that you haven't?
The big ticket things we achieved. I feel that it all happened. I was very ready. I was braced when I started for them not happening. I got a pretty clear picture fairly early on of what we wanted to do, but I was I was very familiar with situations where you don't always get what you want, even though you know that it's what's needed. And I was ready to be the person who banged and banged and banged on the door, and then eventually I would collapse exhausted, and my successor would just step over me and open the door. I was braced for that happening, and I was lucky in that it didn't happen. We got what we wanted. What were the disappointments? Very few. I would have liked to have seen a larger fellowship. And it was just a bit ironic that every time we seemed to attract somebody very, very splendid, you know, when we welcomed them, someone else would leave. So the number of fellows always stayed about the same. And so I would hope perhaps that my successor might grow the fellowship. We could afford to grow, I think. Disappointments, I was sad they took the bus away. It's only a bus, but it was kind of our bus. You know. I'm sorry they took the bus away, but no doubt that will be remedied in the course of time.
And
no, I think you know, I'm leaving. Apart from COVID, of course, which has scuppered life as we know it. And actually, I've felt it. To be honest, it has made my job hard over this last year or so, because so much of the way I did it and wanted to do it was being with people. And now, of course, we couldn't do that because it wasn't safe. So the very thing that gave me most pleasure, really, was denied me on grounds of public safety. And that's been a strange way for the narrative to draw to a close. But I'm pleased to say that even though we've all taken a hit one way or the other financially, you know, because of COVID, Homerton is in a good place. Its future is very secure, I think. And you know, 20 years will shortly fly by, and at the end of that 20 years, there's a little village next to us which we kind of more or less own, and the college will have some interesting choices available as to what it decides to do with those spaces.
yeah, yes. I mean, thinking of the architecture and knowing your particular interest in aesthetics, you know, I'm just wondering about the challenges of extending and adapting a Victorian building, which had probably seen the end of it. Well, you know, with coming to the end of its sort of useful life as a space for higher education and for collegiate life. And what you would see as the major achievements in terms of doing that. So are you happy with the progress that you've managed to make or the college has managed to make as a whole in developing the environment?
Yes, it was our good fortune to be able to purchase 3.5 acres contiguous to the main site, which after all Trinity could never do, otherwise they'd be purchasing St. John's. And there's just no way that a city centre college, no matter how deep its pockets and how well resourced, could find 3.5 acres just next door. Mm-hmm. And so I would do all that over again. Yes. I think we're always helped, of course, throughout by having excellent colleagues, and I believe the best bursar in Cambridge. And in our bursar, Deborah, I think we have someone with quite unusual tenacity and willingness to press and press and press until we get what we want, and that's been shown over and over again. In the estate, and things like the arrangements with St Mary's School, which now give us the best sporting facilities of any college as far as I can see.
Yes.
And none of this has been easy. Getting things through planning in Cambridge is taking things backwards through a very dense hedge. It always is. But yeah, we've done it and stuck at it. So it's not just been me, you know, it's been importantly Deborah and others, and I've been very lucky in the senior team here. The college officers group is absolutely excellent from, you know, all round, and that's been a great help too. The estate is, you mentioned the Victorian parts, and of course there's the 1914 Ibison building, and there are more recent buildings. It's important, I think, that they talk to each other where possible. So I'm very pleased with the emerging looks of the new dining hall, which I think, without being there's no pastiche in it at all, but there are nods to the Great Hall, to Victorian architecture, and to the arts and crafts movement broadly conceived. And I think that's going to be a beautiful modern statement that brings together all the different architectural threads that are in our estate.
Mm.
And so that's something to look forward to.
So it's certainly a case intrigues me as an historian, you know, how having been the wrong side of the railway tracks has actually turned to our advantage, both in the proximity of a biomedical campus, but also our own abilities to expand. And that is quite intriguing.
Yeah, and our emphasis on widening participation has been absolutely crucial and has brought everybody together in a shared effort that we could all commit to. And I think when we started to push more and more on this, becoming a place to advantage the disadvantaged, to welcome the talented who were not from particularly wealthy backgrounds and so on, we perhaps thought we'd found a niche. And in fact, the niche just got bigger and bigger. It was no niche, it was an enormous phenomenon. And of course, it soon became mainstream university policy. So we can be pleased at having got off to a very good start there, but in a way not a start because of the profound echoes of Homerton's past.
Yes. Well, can I throw that?
Yeah, of course.
Can I throw that back to Steve, perhaps to finish off on, Steve, because his background is very much in terms of widening participation from being a student right through to being an admissions tutor. And perhaps you could wind up on that note, Steve.
Yes, well, I confess to Peter that I was one of Sir Alec Clegg's in the West Riding's experiments, in the sense that I was offered a place at Clare because I was from Yorkshire, and that was enough. And that's absolutely right, of course. I didn't end up taking it, but it does mean I was one of the first people in Cambridge from a comprehensive school, and never found that problematic or difficult while I was here. But it also led to my thinking about admissions for Homerton when I first got that job of dealing with it. And one thing I think has become clear, and Geoff, this has very much happened on your watch, that not only have we maintained the same kind of principles of wanting to give people of a relatively disadvantaged background a chance, but we've also done that at the same time as maintaining applications, and rather than maintaining them, actually increasing them to a rather phenomenal level in the last couple of years.
Yes.
Beyond my time, in fact, into Paul and George's time, of numbers of applications to Homerton now being very much not the youngster on the patches also ran status, but very much those of older colleges. I can say something about that sense that not only are we just been part of the university's allure, you know, we are attracting a large amount of highly qualified applications, but also, as you said, starting and also then being with the university on their drive towards more egalitarian ways of approaching students.
Yes, it's a work in progress. There's further to go, and I very much look forward to seeing what my successor, Lord Woolley, does in that regard, because obviously these issues are very important to him.
Yeah.
And we have been able to have our cake and eat it, in the sense that we've in no way lowered any standards. It's harder and harder to get into Homerton, but it's more and more a place that people do want to come to. So we're I think applications have been up 30% on last year for about the last 3 years, and clearly some kind of tipping point has been achieved in terms of our public profile and therefore desirability. But there's still work to be done there, and it will be very fascinating to see how it unfolds over these next years. And we've also been very international, and that's important too, that we've taken people from all around the globe. And I think it's clear that we have a commitment to an educational experience, which is one where you learn from difference, from people who are different from your background, your county, your country, your family, the beliefs or no beliefs that you grew up with. You'll now meet people who've got a different perspective on things. And that is a great strength of the community. I think that sheer variety that the international brings as well. Yeah. So I hope we can maintain that.